In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. O heavenly King, help of the Spirit of truth, Lord, ever present, fullest all things, treasury of good things, and giver of life, come and abide in us, cleanse us from every stain, and save our souls, O good one. Amen.
I was like, oh, maybe I won't say that.
Right. So tonight we just talk about North America. Before we do that, I came across a book that connects with last week's. It's called Witnesses for Christ, Orthodox Christian Neo-Martyrs, meaning new martyrs, from the Ottoman period, 1437 to 1860. Remember, I mentioned that there was many martyrs that were similar to the saint I spoke about last week, whose feast day it was, St. George, the new martyr of the Ionians. And that there were many martyrs in that Ottoman period. And so at the library at St. Mary Magdalene's Chapel, I found this book. As you can see, it's not thin. It's not thin. And I didn't take the time, unfortunately, to count the martyrs that are here, but there are broken into centuries, so 5th century, 6th century, 17th century. In terms of the content page, the 15th, 16th century, and the 17th century all fit on one page. The 17th century continues to the next page. The 18th century picks up and continues for another page, and then the 19th century finishes. So you get the sense. I'll pass this around. You can kind of look through it, and there's some icons in the middle of some of the martyrs of that time period. So these are all martyrs from those who lived within the confines of the Ottoman Empire and died either because they would not convert to Islam or because they did and they repented and therefore they died for having returned to the church. So tonight, though, we move on to Christianity in the New World, specifically in North America. And the first missionaries to North America are Catholic missionaries. And we'll just touch on them a little bit. I think people are more familiar with the Catholic missionaries and their work, at least for us who are from California and all the Catholic missions that were established there, very familiar with the history. The Franciscans were the first missionaries to come to what was termed New Spain, all the territories in the New World claimed by the Kingdom of Spain. And they come following Cortez in 1523. The missionaries, beyond spreading the Roman Catholic faith, were linguists, learning the languages of the native people, educators for both children and adults. There was a significant effort at teaching agricultural skills and building techniques, Western European building techniques, and so forth. And so this is part of the work of the missionaries. The Franciscans weren't the only ones that came, of course. Dominicans came in much smaller numbers, but the Jesuits were also very active. They are arriving in the New World around 1517. And we'll run into them again in our history as we go forward. But they're mainly working in Central America and South America, the Caribbean islands, in the parts of North America, of course, being what we think of as Mexico and the southwest of the United States, as well as Florida. We can't forget Florida was a part of the Spanish Empire as well before it being sold to the United States. To give a sense of who comes to the New World, we all think of Columbus, of course, in 1492. But But the Spanish weren't the only settlers in the New World, but they're the first. They are the first. 1492 Columbus, of course. 1496 Santo Domingo establishes what becomes the Dominican Republic. The city of Santo Domingo is established, which becomes the area then becomes the Dominican Republic in 1496. San Juan in Puerto Rico is established in 1508. Nombre de Dios in Panama is 1510. Havana in Cuba, 1519. Veracruz in Mexico, 1519. Panama City in Panama, 1519. So you see kind of the early exploration of the New World is very much in Mexico and down and south, and in the Caribbean. It's then later, there's a gap here, 1565, that St. Augustine, Florida is founded, and it is the oldest city in North America in terms of the United States and Canada. St. Augustine, Florida is the oldest city, being founded in 1565. We all think of course, New England as being the locus of all the old settlements, but Spanish came to Florida first. The British only then show up to the Roanoke colony in 1578. And if you know your American history, the Roanoke colony disappears. All the people who settled that, when they came back the next year with another ship with supplies, nobody was there, and nobody knows what happened. One of those mysteries. The British then found St. John's in Newfoundland in 1583, and then it's in 1607 that the first continuous settlement in what becomes the United States is founded in Jamestown. This is in 1607, over 100 years after the Spanish settlements initially. Santa Fe, New Mexico is also founded in 1607, but on a very different part of the United States. Again, that we normally think of being the places being settled first in the coastal, the eastern seaboard and so forth. Jamestown and Santa Fe are the same year. Santa Fe really is the kind of furthest north, though, that the Spanish go in terms of at least settling permanent settlements. Santa Fe becomes kind of a northern point of a major settlement. And for us here in Kansas, it becomes the place that the Santa Fe Trail is going to, again, because to move trade from our part of the country, the plains, and east of us, going to the southwest. Quebec City, now the French get involved. 1608, Quebec City is established. Hampton, Virginia, 1610. I can't pronounce this, so you tell me how I should say this. Kecoughtan in Virginia. Kecoughtan, that's my guess. 1610. I guess didn't play a significant role in history, so none of us know anything about it. But Newport News in Virginia is also established. 1613, Albany, New York. Think about this. The capital of New York, the state of New York, is older than New York City, actually. Albany, New York is established in 1614. If you go up the Hudson River to where the Mohawk River enters, that's where Albany, New York is. That's older than New York City, or what was called New Amsterdam, because New Amsterdam is settled in 1625 by the Netherlands, not by the British. The Dutch settle New York. And there's a whole interesting discussion to be had about how New York is a Dutch city, not a English city, what that means. Which then relates into a certain presidential candidate who's from New York City, and currently running for office in the heritage of being, in a sense, from New Amsterdam or from a Dutch colony, how that's different than being from a British colony and so forth. Anyway, a lot could be said about Donald Trump and the Dutch and money, but we don't have time for that tonight. Maybe we'll get into that another night. So a teaser, or probably not in this series at least, but interesting things. And then the one that we all think of when we think of the settling of North America by the British, which is the Pilgrims, right? It's the last of all of these. 1628. The Massachusetts Bay Colony is founded in 1628, over 125 years after Columbus, and after the Spanish have been very busy, and all kinds of other settlements have been settled in Virginia. But the Massachusetts Bay Colony was unique and different from the Virginia colonies. Those who came to Virginia mostly were coming because they were the second or third sons of nobility and had no inheritance, no land to inherit in the old world. And so they were trying to establish themselves on property. And so their motivation in coming to North America and Virginia was mostly economic, not religious. Whereas the settlement of the Massachusetts Bay Colony is a strictly religious establishment. And so I will read to you, it's going to be a long section, but from Father John Strickland's, this is his third volume in his 4-volume series, Paradise and Utopia, The Rise and Fall of What the West Once Was, Volume 3, The Age of Utopia. I've referenced this series before, and we're going to read his section here on the Puritans, because it's the Puritans who settle, are the ones establishing the settlement in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but they're coming from England. And so we're going to kind of go backwards a little bit into the 17th century, or into them. Why do they come to Massachusetts? What's the context here? So in England, Father John begins, in England, the secularization of the state had been looming since the days of Henry VIII. Remember, Henry VIII is the one who establishes the Church of England, breaking it away from the Catholic Church and so forth. And this begins a whole series of difficulties and power struggles, and who's going to have influence, and what kind of Protestantism is going to, in a sense, guide the English Church, the Church of England. And what you have is a succession of different directions that the king or the leaders of what becomes the Anglican Church want to take, sometimes diametrically opposed to them. And so the Puritans are a part of that. A century passed, however, before the logic of the reformational Christianity finally took hold. From the time of Henry's son, Edward VI, Calvinists used their control of Parliament to purify the Anglican Church of Roman Catholic tradition. But in the 17th century, a Romophile monarchy, meaning a lover of Rome, began to resist them. When King Charles I, who reigned from 1625 to 1649, appointed the liturgically conservative William Laud as Archbishop of Canterbury, these Puritans launched a revolution that came to be known as the English Civil War, 1642 to 1651. They eventually fabricated charges of treason against Laud and beheaded him. Then came the military defeat and the execution of Charles himself, meaning they killed the king. After this, a righteous commonwealth was declared under Puritan rule. Public morality was reformed, with Sunday church attendance mandated by law. And the celebration of the incarnation of Christ at Christmas, which was seen as a remnant of popery, meaning of Roman Catholic tradition, was banned. They banned Christmas. Under Oliver Cromwell, who dies in 1658, who had experienced a Calvinist-styled spiritual conversion, Britain became a Christian police state in which Scottish Presbyterians and Irish Roman Catholics were not only persecuted, but massacred by the thousands in merciless battles and sieges. Calvinism changed the political character of the new Christendom, but it was a change that had much in common with efforts to transform the seculum ongoing since the time of the Papal Reformation. In his study of reformational indignation during the English Civil War, Michael Walzer noted that, quote, the power of an ideology lies in its capacity to activate its adherents and to change the world. Its content is necessarily a description of contemporary experience as unacceptable and unnecessary, and a rejection of any merely personal transcendence or salvation. Its practical effect is to generate organization and cooperative activity. Calvinist ideology, he concludes, can be briefly summarized in these terms. The permanent, inescapable estrangement of man from God is the starting point of Calvin's politics. Remember, Calvinism had this very clear idea that man was completely depraved. There was nothing that he could do towards his salvation, and that salvation was only based on God's election, that you were predestined to be saved. You had no choice in it whatsoever. But this creates this very clear estrangement from man and God if you can't do anything. And this is the beginning point then for Calvin's politics. Remember, Calvin becomes, in a sense, the head of a state and a church in Switzerland. As we shall see, it was also the starting point of modern revolutionary ideology. As this anthropological estrangement was beginning to occur, other Calvinists were making their exodus from a corrupt Europe to a promised land called America. So the idea of the Calvinists were they needed to come in and purge out all of that popery, not the nice smelling stuff, right? But anything related to the Pope, anything of Roman Catholic, and purify it, and therefore the state would become, in a sense, properly Christian in their eyes, in their Calvinist conception. And that this was, in the early Reformation, this is very much what was going on. It was kind of all or nothing. The Lutherans, who lived in a land where a prince was Lutheran, he demanded all of his subjects be Lutheran. If the prince was Roman Catholic, you had to be Roman Catholic. If the prince was Calvinist, you had to be Calvinist. And so those in power have this kind of this view to the church. Christianity has to follow the form, in a sense, of the king or of the rulers or the dominant class. And so this results in a lot of people dying. Yes.
Did that carry over into Russia? Did the Russians also force
No.
to be Orthodox?
Because not in this context. In this time of history, in the 17th and 18th century, you don't have. In Russia, the Orthodox Church has to respond to the Protestant Reformation as something coming in from the outside, whereas in Western Europe, this is something growing up within it and kind of taking hold to various kingdoms. So just like the Greeks in the Orthodox in the Ottoman Empire, they're having to respond to something that's coming to them. But the imperial powers over them do not necessarily desire, in a sense, Protestant belief to be enacted. And so that's the point, though. The princes were, in a sense, the muscle behind the religious reform in some ways, in many ways. So the power of the state was being used to initiate Calvin's reforms, Luther's reforms, Zwingli's reforms, and so forth. Henry VIII's reforms of the church, right? Church is being reformed by the state. And this is The 30 Years' War is the result of all of this. The Peace of Westphalia basically says you follow the faith of the prince that you live under. And that's how it's resolved at this point going forward. Now we'll see how that changes, though.
And isn't it the same that happens in England? Isn't it like if the Queen was Catholic, you were Catholic, and the Queen was Protestant?
Yeah, if the Queen is Catholic, you're Catholic. If the Queen is Protestant, you're Protestant, and that's same thing going on here. But in this case, the king is killed, and the Puritans are in power, and so the Puritans are trying to purge any sense of Catholicism from the state, or Scottish Presbyterians either, because they're not right either. So you have the Puritans in England trying to set up in a sense, the ideal Christian society. This is with the power of the state behind them. And so the Puritans, who call themselves pilgrims, when they come in the 1620s, 1628, right? None of this has happened yet in England, right? But that desire to form society in kind of this Christian utopian state is present in Puritanism. It manifests itself in England in one way, and in America, it manifests itself similarly in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So the founding of New England represented in some ways the end of Christendom's paradisiacal vision of statecraft. It's kind of the last gasp of the state seeing itself as trying to emulate heaven on earth. True to its origin, the experience of the kingdom of heaven in Plymouth, the first colony founded in the 1620s by a group of Anglican separatists calling themselves pilgrims, was decidedly pessimistic, and in the most puritanical sense of the word. Settlers established a dour social order in which dancing and all other forms of merrymaking were scorned as demonic, because that was the sentiment of the Puritans. They were iconoclastic, so images were forbidden. In any kind of celebration that was in any way tainted with popery, again, it had to be purged, and this is where we get the sense of someone's being puritanical, right? The very black and white, straight-laced, no nonsense, no fun, right? Well, there's a reason why that has that connotation.
Oh, like the picture with the farmer and his wife?
Yes, picture with the American Gothic.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Settlers established, so no dancing, no merrymaking. A decade later, another group of Calvinists came from England and founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony near Boston. During the long sail, their leader, John Winthrop, preached aboard the ship Arabella about the importance of the Puritan mission to settle America. New England would be, quote, a city on a hill, as we've all heard that phrase, city on a hill. He declared, and all of Europe was watching to see what she would do to reform a corrupt old world Christendom. At the start, New England was a New Jerusalem, an eschatological community of God's elect. This defined her identity more than anything else. But it was an identity grounded in public morality and reformational doctrine rather than heavenly immanence. So instead of God coming down to us, it's we're behaving in the right ways and we're believing the right things is the emphasis. The community was profoundly spiritual in character. The colony of Virginia to the south, for instance, might be driven by the desire for wealth and adventure, but not the Puritans. The building of settlements, the cultivation of food, the conquest of natives, all these were considered necessary, but secondary to their religious purpose. Hence, the readiness to undergo unbelievable deprivations and sorrows. Among the 102 who alighted from the Mayflower at Plymouth in the fall of 1620, nearly half died before spring arrived. But the colonists did not see themselves as miserable refugees. The Bay Company, wrote Perry Miller, was not a battered remnant of suffering separatists thrown on a rocky shore. It was an organized task force of Christians executing a flank attack on the corruptions of Christendom. These Puritans did not flee to America. They went in order to work out that complete reformation, which was not yet accomplished in England and Europe, but which would quickly be accomplished if only the saints back there had a working model to guide them. They came to America, in a sense, to set the tone, to set the example of, in a sense, what a proper Christian society should look like. Thinking that once they did that, it could be transmitted back to Europe. It was with this transformational purpose in mind, this errand in the wilderness, as one preacher put it later in the century, that Britain's northernmost and most famous American colony was established. Nevertheless, as the self-proclaimed headquarters of cosmic reformation, this city on a hill eventually ceased to emit light. By the end of the 17th century, her zealous divines had very little to offer in increasingly secularized Europe. For after the death of Cromwell, a crypto-Catholic monarchy was restored, and the homeland ceased to be a Calvinist stronghold. In 1688, a moderate Protestant political establishment enacted the Glorious Revolution, which through the creation of a constitution the following year brought a permanent end to confessional militancy, meaning the fighting between Protestant confessions. Varieties of Christianity were now tolerated, with the notable exception of Roman Catholicism. So Protestant forms were tolerated, not Catholicism. And a civil peace that had been wanting since the time of Henry VIII was likewise restored. It turned out that despite the promises of John Winthrop, the eyes of Christendom were no longer upon New England. This caused an existential crisis for the Puritans there in New England, made worse by the fact that Calvinism was in trouble throughout the rest of Europe. The reason was a decline in sympathy for its goals. The earliest Protestants had depended on a heightened popular devotion, and those who affiliated with the Reformed Church of the Calvinists proved to be the most devout. But such sympathy was in decline. And as this happened, a motivationally depleted Calvinist Christendom became the breeding ground of secularism. In a sense, after a few decades, the excitement can't carry you anymore. And the emotionalism of it all, right? It wears out, and you don't pass that on, in a sense, to your children, or your grandchildren. The excitement of the conversion, that conversion experience, which was so central to the early Reformed movements and the ones that come later. Holland is a good example. During the decades following Calvin's death, the land of Erasmus had become a refuge of separatists and a stage for iconoclasts. Remember, all of the early reformers, except for Luther, were iconoclasts. They despised images, the depiction of God in any way. A bare cross maybe was the thing that was allowed, but by and large, they were iconoclasts. But almost as suddenly, during the 17th century, the Dutch Republic reclined into a cozy preoccupation with worldly things. Reaping riches from overseas colonial empire, its people spent them on building the world's largest navy, and in moments of theological liberality, amassed the exquisite paintings of Rembrandt. In the meantime, its government relaxed restrictions on the publication of religiously subversive literature. In a sense, things that aren't the official line of the established church in Holland. You could publish other ideas. And this provided a shield for skeptics and early deists like Pierre Bailly. Other former bastions of Calvinism, such as Switzerland, where Calvin created a Geneva consistory, Scotland, home of the Presbyterianism of John Knox, and as we have seen, New England, would likewise become centers of secularism during the 18th century. And reformational Christianity only deteriorated further after that. In fact, it is the great irony of Calvinist Christendom that it became the cradle of a post-Christian culture, which by the end of the 20th century would pioneer the legalization of prostitution, drug use, same-sex marriage, euthanasia, abortion, and perhaps in the near future, infanticide. Back in New England, the Puritans had their own unique challenges. They embraced the innovative ecclesiology by which an episcopal hierarchy, meaning having bishops, was gotten rid of, and this was exchanged for self-administered congregations, which became known as Congregationalism, and left the Puritans more vulnerable to popular indifference than emerging mainline Protestants like the Lutherans and the Anglicans. The Lutherans and the Anglicans had, in a sense, a hierarchy, and therefore a hierarchy that would guide the denomination. The Puritans, it was all congregational. There was no hierarchy. And so the whims of each congregation, in a sense, could take those congregations in very different directions, which did not lead to any great sense of unity amongst them and a variety of interpretations and beliefs. For this reason, they could not easily tolerate or even survive the waning of their members' zeal. Ominously, after mid-century, the curve of religious intensity was beginning to drop or to droop. One index of decline was the settlers' indifference to religious uniformity. So early on, the Puritans demanded a uniformity, and with great zeal. That was very much heavy-handed and tyrannical, and thus you get, the whole image of someone being puritanical. But this zeal falls off a cliff. The Pilgrims may have been victims of persecution in the old world, but they did not hesitate to become agents of it in the new. As Miller put it, the government of Massachusetts was a dictatorship and never pretended to be anything else. It was a dictatorship not of a single tyrant or of an economic class or of a political faction, but of the holy and the regenerate. Yet, as more and more settlers disembarked at Boston Harbor, confessional homogeneity proved unsustainable. Even in the 1630s, for instance, theological disputes resulted in the expulsion from Massachusetts, first of Roger Williams and then of Anne Hutchinson. Both relocated to Providence, where they contributed to the establishment of a new colony, the state of Rhode Island, in which religious liberty was proclaimed by law for the first time since the Emperor Constantine's Edict of Milan. In 1659, the first of 4 Quakers was hanged in Boston Common after refusing to remain silent about his heterodox beliefs. These executions and the more notorious Salem witch trials of 1693 shocked many New Englanders into holding a more moderate opinion about the influence of Calvinism within the government. When social cohesion demanded the persecution of heresy and moral deviance, it seemed to many the political order was subverted. Indeed, the Puritan zeal of second and third generation settlers was clearly waning by the end of the century. The key to parish membership had long been the vocal and public expressions of one's personal transformation through a conversion experience. To be a part of the church, you had to have had a conversion experience. With its doctrine of predestinarian election, Calvinism emphasized righteousness over repentance and submission to a transcendent judge instead of sacramental participation in his imminent presence on earth. The experience of the conversion, in a sense, was the sacrament, the only one, if we could think of it that way. And there was nothing else to participate in because you were the elect then. You'd been elected, all done. Nothing needs to be done now. Repentance and so forth. You've arrived. Eucharistic communion and access to baptism for one's children depended on one's having had a demonstrable conversion experience. If you hadn't had that, up until this point, you couldn't take communion, nor could you have your children baptized. So they still had these things, but the the sacrament par excellence was the conversion experience for them that gave you access to anything, to even church membership. However, with the growing indifference threatening to dissolve the New England Commonwealth, Puritan divines resolved at a Boston Synod in 1662 to adopt a measure called the Halfway Covenant. By its terms, so-called unregenerate members of congregations who failed to give compelling evidence of their conversion were nonetheless suffered to have their children baptized, provided lesser evidence of zeal was presented. More congregations ultimately adopted this compromise solution, though zealots like Harvard College president Increase Mather initially launched a campaign against it. As the elect gave way before the unregenerate, then New England experienced a kind of identity crisis. Gone now was the hope of leading the old world back to the religion of the apostles. Gone also was the hope of establishing a perfect Christian commonwealth, a society of good moral order and, if not, of heavenly eminence. Fallen man had proven too obstinate and the world too enticing for even that limited measure of paradise. The way forward appeared to pass through the seculum, or secularism. For the Puritans of both Englands, the old and the new, the 17th century had begun with a bang but ended with a whimper, or to put it in their own terms, it had begun with a conversion but was ending in a compromise. Many a clergyman tried to stir up the old zeal. In the colonies, the transition was marked by the rise of a uniquely American form of political literature known as the jerry-maid. Examples were issued by preachers on days of special public significance, such as elections and fasts, named for the inspired by the prophet Jeremiah about the impending judgment of Jerusalem. These were, doom and gloom. God's wrath is coming, so get yourself converted. Kind of statements. Cotton Mather, the son of Increase Mather, wrote a 2-volume history of New England entitled Magnalia Christi Americana that worked fire and brimstone homiletics into what Paul Johnson has called the first great American work of literature in America. It was only, in some ways, the first great recognition that New England had become a post-puritanical civilization. It was becoming secularized. Puritanical Christendom is established by Mather as a civilization based on a culture of reformational Christianity. 2 generations of men have historically struggled against one another. He claims in the introduction, reformers and anti-reformers. And it is the latter, he laments, who have been by the opening of the 18th century gained the upper hand through its preoccupation with earthly prosperity. They seek to stop the progress of the desired reformation and to persecute those most heartily wished well unto it. Unfaithful descendants of New England's puritanical founders have become preoccupied with secular concernments. Quoting a Latin adage, Mather concludes that religion brought forth prosperity, and the daughter destroyed the mother. Prosperity destroyed religion. In the New World, as in the Old, the seculum had snuffed out the reformational lamp of Puritanism. But it didn't end there. This takes us now into the 18th century, to what we call the First Great Awakening. So that gives you the context that leads up to the First Great Awakening. So in Europe, the Enlightenment was flourishing. So we have the Reformation, and we have something else called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, right, is the focus on the material world and using science to explore the material world and feel that you're being enlightened by all of the discoveries. Whereas the Reformation is a religious movement. Both of these things are going on at the same time. In Europe, the Enlightenment was flourishing, and a belief called deism was becoming very popular. Deism is the religion that there is a religious philosophy that there's a supreme being who's the creator of the universe. It's the great watchmaker. He makes the watch, he winds it up, and he lets it run, and he doesn't interact with it. Many of the founding fathers of the United States were deists. This was their religious, like Thomas Jefferson. This is their religious belief. And so the focus of the deists is the watch, right? The material world. That's why they're naturalists or proto-scientists and so forth. In New England, the Reverend Jonathan Edwards preached about the need to repent and be converted or regenerated at this same time. If you know, Jonathan Edwards is one of the great famous American preachers of this time period. Conversion being an emotional experience of one's feeling called by God. Edwards, one of America's original theologians, Edwards is also the third president of Princeton University. I don't know if Princeton's excited about that anymore, but that's their legacy. So you have Jonathan Edwards preaching this message of conversion, and in the areas that he's preaching, he has a number of people who start having these conversion experiences. Very emotional. Some of them are like a roller coaster. There's examples where these people become very, in a sense, religious and then swing back the other way, becoming very unreligious or kind of unstable. His uncle had a conversion experience, but then eventually committed suicide. So there is this, the emotional reality of all of this is not always very stable. The other preacher that we're going to talk about as well, one of the other preachers, George Whitefield, an Anglican priest who lost favor in England. He's expelled from preaching in England, and so he begins to preach to farmers in their fields by the thousands. He comes to the American colonies. Whitefield, who is an actor by training, delivered emotional sermons where he would shout, weep, and tremble as he spoke to God. He traveled from New England to Georgia and is considered by many to be the founder of the evangelical movement in America. He was so loved by his followers that during the Revolutionary War, his body was dug up so that soldiers could take scraps of his clothing as like a relic to protect themselves, believing that if they had it, they wouldn't die. That's how loved this man was. Very interesting how they had that desire, though, to have a relic of him. That is very familiar to us, in a sense. The reverence for, in a sense, even the body of the saint and the relics of the saint in Orthodoxy is not unknown to us at all. Even Benjamin Franklin, who was a religious skeptic, became Whitefield's good friend and printed many of his sermons. Franklin once emptied his coin purse after hearing him speak in Philadelphia. The first Great Awakening, then, is this religious explosion, right? The Puritans had tanked. People were nominally Christian, but you still had this understanding that you had to have this conversion experience to be the elect. And so those who are adamant in the pulpit about this, right, are able, some of them, to stir the emotions of people through their homilies. It's Jonathan Edwards who is the one who gives the famous homily, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," which many of us had to read in school. And so there's this explosion of religious fervor in the 1740s, roughly, early 1740s. And you get this emergence of what are then called the New Lights versus the Old Lights. The New Lights who have had this experience, this conversion experience, and have kind of returned to religious zeal, and the Old Lights who prefer the old ways. This is a pattern that just every generation repeats itself in American religious circles, at least, especially Protestant circles. You know, so you can drive down the road here in Topeka and you'll see a sign for a church that says hymn singing, Bible preaching church, right? What is that meaning? We sing the old hymns. We preach from the Bible. We hold on to the old ways from that Protestant perspective, right? And then you can go somewhere else, and the New Lights are going to have a band, and they're going to have, it's more like a rock concert, and the praise and worship music is, again, very emotionally charged. Okay? So this old light and new light, every generation has their old light and new lights. What they want changes a little bit, but that pattern persists. So the new lights denied the old lights legitimacy as ministers, who were unregenerated or unconverted in their eyes by having an experience of conversion. Conversion in one's ability to convert others gave authority to these new preachers, not ordination per se. Everything seemed to depend on the emotions, is what Father John Strickland says about this time period. The First Great Awakening expression of personal faith detached from traditional ecclesiology as well. The emphasis was on an individual's personal experience of conversion, separate from any kind of connection to something greater than themselves, to a body that is the church, and defining what that body is and how it functions. We call this also pietism, the emphasis of the individual's personal experience. This Great Awakening and this pietism split the Presbyterian denomination in half and produced new denominations. With so many new denominations in the 18th century, it was clear that no one religion would dominate any region or colonies. So therefore, the sense of the Puritans, in a sense, creating this homogeneous society around faith, really, it dies. And you have a society where there is no unifying faith, except at the most kind of general thin layer of being somewhat Christian. But the Presbyterians say one thing, the Methodists will say something else, the Anglicans will do it a different way, and so forth. And you don't include the Catholics in this yet, though. That only comes in the 20th century. That Protestants will begin to think of Catholics as being Christian again. It takes a while. John Wesley, who dies in 1791, has a conversion experience and feels that this is more important than the church itself. His personal experience is more important over the participation than in the life of the church. And I'm going to read just a very short section now about John Wesley from Father John Strickland's book. John Wesley becomes the founder of Methodism, the Methodist churches. And again, we have to say churches plural, because it's not just one that's, in a sense, one denomination founded. One particularly disconnect believer was John Wesley, who dies in 1791. With his brother Charles, he established at Oxford University, a group known by critics as the Holy Club, the intention of which was to intensify piety as a little church within the church. After an abortive mission to the colony of Georgia, Wesley had a conversion experience in 1738 while praying with a group of Moravian brethren in London. This led him to assert three claims about what he considered true Christianity. First, as Spencer has emphasized, true believers must experience a new birth after being baptized as infants. Second, the nature of their conversion experience was so pivotal that the cultivation of it became a key element in salvation. They could not simply adhere to the doctrine and fulfill the obligations of the institutional church to which they belonged. It was necessary to follow a practical method of life which would lead, even now in this world, to an experience of heavenly transformation or conversion. Here, Wesley found inspiration in the writings of Macarius of Egypt, Saint Macarius of Egypt, whose early practice of monasticism was directed towards the experience of what we call deification. John Wesley was kind of approaching this idea somewhat. This set Wesley apart from earlier Protestant fathers who inherited a forensic understanding of salvation from their Roman Catholic predecessors. Calvin, the most extreme among them, expressed an Augustinian aversion to free will and the cooperation of the elect with God. Wesley self-consciously rejected this pessimistic view of man, falling back on the doctrine called Arminianism that affirmed the believer's cooperation with God, that we had free will. John Wesley believed we had free will, which is a good thing because we do. This therapeutic understanding of salvation was, as several scholars have noted, much closer to that of the Orthodox Church. Wesley's ecclesiology, however, was not. So his understanding of salvation was closer to us, but his understanding of what the church was not. Like Spencer, his effort to correct the perceived shortcomings of reformational Christianity. Remember, the reformers are always trying to reform all the mistakes they see. And the next set of reformers try to reform them. And the next set of reformers try to reform them. Right? This is the process. And this led him to a third claim that salvation is predominantly an individualistic event. To be sure, worship and the sacraments remained important elements in Methodism, as the new denomination he founded later named itself. And emotionally charged hymns, especially those composed by his brother Charles, became classics of Protestant Christendom. But his practice of ordaining clergy while only a priest, without episcopal authority, defied traditional Christianity. The fruits of Wesley's innovations were stunning. Tens of thousands flocked to hear him preach in open fields. In no time at all, he was surrounded by other evangelists. Among them was our friend George Whitefield that we've already talked about, who had already been an early member of Wesley's Orthodox circle and had even followed John to America. Back in England, however, he broke from his mentor, John's embracing of Arminianism with its stigma of the ancient Pelagian heresy against which Augustine had so tenaciously fought was too much for Whitefield. Whitefield asserted Calvinism in its most vigorous forms and now attacked Wesley for backpedaling predestinarianism. So, as soon as the West indicated an interest in the long-forgotten East, an instinctual pessimism again intervened. And as it did so, another schism was spawned. Whitefield's theological disagreements with the Wesleys gave rise to a Calvinist variant of Methodism and the creation of a rival church. Within a century, no fewer than 9 Methodist denominations existed in England. In America, the number rose to more than 24. They couldn't all agree on that simple meaning of the scripture. And so they created their own denominations. The British, okay, we'll stop there. So that gives you John Wesley's part here in all of this. The 24 or more Methodist churches, Methodist denominations that emerge in North America. And that's why you can understand why there is something called the United Methodist Church today, because it united a bunch of them at some point. So the Methodist Church is an outgrowing of the Great Awakening in Europe and the US, but it's the free will or the Arminian version of it, where others follow the Calvinist understanding. So the Anglicans, some Baptists, and Pentecostals, they are all Arminian in their theology, whereas Presbyterians, the Dutch Reformed, and so forth, they all are, or Reformed churches in general, all follow the Calvinist teaching on predestination. There is no free will. And then there's groups in between. Aspects of American Christianity, its emotional, revival-centered search for emotional experience all find its roots here in this time period. Doctrinal minimalism, pluralistic concerning the forms of worship, its vague sense of ecclesiology, and this movement towards this understanding of an invisible church, all come out of this experience of the Great Awakening, where the personal experience is primary to everything else, and therefore To have any sense of cohesion, you have to minimize any kind of difference. And you can't assert, in a sense, any authority over anything beyond your own personal experience of your conversion. That becomes the only kind of authoritative thing you can speak about, how you were converted, how you were born again, as people say in the modern days, right? That's the focus. And you minimize discussions of theology and ecclesiology and salvation in this, in sense of what does this all mean? Salvation as a response to an altar call, right, has its roots here in the First Great Awakening. And the work of Billy Graham is just an outgrowth of this revival tradition, which is distinctly then Western and particularly American. So all these things that many people just take for granted of when they go to church, right, they have their roots more so in the 17th and 18th century, particularly the 18th century American experience of the Great Awakening, and these things don't go back, in a sense, beyond that. So, but at the same time, in 1738, same time period, you have the conversion of a man named Philip Ludwell III of Virginia to the Orthodox Church. He is the first known American convert to Eastern Orthodox Christianity. He was a prominent figure in pre-revolutionary Virginia and a relative by blood or marriage of many great early figures in American history, from George Washington to Richard Henry Lee of the great Lee family of Virginia, which General Lee of the Civil War era is a descendant. The scion of one of the largest landholding and politically prominent families in early Virginia. He was born at Green Spring, near Williamsburg, Virginia, December 28, 1716, making him a contemporary of Benjamin Franklin, with whom he shared a friendship. 1 year after his marriage in the summer of 1737 to Frances Grimes, herself the granddaughter of the governor of Virginia, the young Ludwell traveled from Williamsburg to London, England. 23 years later, in 1761, the Orthodox priest in London, Father Stephen Ivanovsky, wrote, quote, in 1738, during the incumbency of the late hieromonk Bartholomew Cassano, at this holy church, an English gentleman named Ludwell, born in the American lands and living there in the province of Virginia, came to London seeking the true faith, which he, with God's help, has swiftly found in his holy Greco-Russian church. And so on the 31st of December of the same year, he was confirmed in the same with the Holy Chrism. It was received by chrismation. The papers of the Lee family state that upon Ludwell's return to Virginia, he brought with him a prodigy named John Wales, who would later make his mark on history as the father of both Martha Wales, wife of Thomas Jefferson, and Sally Hemings of Monticello. In 1740, Ludwell returned to Virginia, and from 1742 to 49, he was a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, where he argued for higher taxes on the importation of African slaves and headed a committee to seek a cure for cancer. The point of the taxes hikes was to make it more difficult to bring slaves, to decrease the slave trade. That was the point. He was trying to work against the slave trade by making it more expensive. In 1752, he became a member of the Royal Governor's Council and served in this capacity until his death in 1767. As a member of the council, he was instrumental in obtaining a commission for a young man named George Washington as colonel of the Virginia Regiment in 1755. Meanwhile, he continued to secretly practice his Orthodox faith, which at that time was treasonable. Being a government official, he had to be, in a sense, a member of the Anglican Church. At some point in the 1750s, he embarked upon an English translation of the Orthodox Confession of the Catholic and Apostolic Eastern Church, which was composed in 1640 by the Orthodox Bishop Metropolitan Peter Mogila of Kiev. Ludwell dedicated his translation to, quote, the devout Christian reader, and quoted the prophet Jeremiah. Thus saith the Lord, stand ye in the ways, and see, and ask for the old paths. Where is the good way? And walk therein, and ye shall find rest for your souls. By 1751, he had 3 daughters, Hannah, Frances, and Lucy. In 1753, his wife, Frances, died. In 1760, he moved with his daughters to London, where they were received into the Orthodox Church on Holy Wednesday in 1762. In the same year, with the blessing of the Holy Synod of the Orthodox Church of Russia, Ludwell's translation of the Catechism was published in a cloth edition. The Russian Synod also authorized Father Stephen Ivanovsky in London to give the Ludwell family the consecrated elements of bread and wine to take back with them to Virginia, and to prepare for them the appropriate forms of Orthodox prayer for use in their native land, which is a rather remarkable thing, that a layperson was allowed, in a sense, to carry the sacraments and administer them to himself and his family, because there was no priest. One extant copy of many of what may be this Ordo has been found in bound but handwritten form. It includes Ludwell's translation of the 3 principal Orthodox liturgies, morning and evening prayers, the service of confession, and other texts that he translated into English. Philip Ludwell died in London, March 14, 1767, after a long illness, and there he is buried in the Anglican Church of St. Mary's, Stratford Bow. Over 200 years later, his life and inspiring story of faith is becoming known and reshaping our views of early America. That's all from ludwell.org. There is an actual official organization dedicated to the memory of Philip Ludwell III and the further research. There's many artifacts from Green Springs, which is a part of the Williamsburg National Park, that they're attempting to get access to analyze, because some of these things have just never been looked at. And it's very likely that we know where his home chapel was on the property, and artifacts from there they're hoping to examine at some point. So all of this, remember the Great Awakening is the 1740s. 1741 to 1867 is the time period also of the Russian-American colony of the Russian Empire in Alaska down to Northern California. We don't realize that the Russians settled all the way down to Fort Ross, which is north of San Francisco. In 1639, the Russian explorers reached the Pacific Ocean. In 1741, Bering crossed what becomes the Bering Strait and sights the Atlantic coast. In 1784, with encouragement from Empress Catherine the Great, the explorer Gregory Shelikov founds Russia's first permanent settlement in Alaska at 3 Saints Bay on Kodiak Island. In 1794, missionaries from Russia arrive, having been requested by natives and the Russian American Company at Kodiak Island, 10 monks, including the future St. Herman and St. Juvenali. St. Juvenali will die as a martyr, 1797, being killed by natives at Lake Iliamna in Alaska. Upon their arrival, 12,000 natives were baptized and or chrismated by the missionaries in their first 2 years of missionary work. The missionaries also proved to be ardent champions of human rights of the natives, who were often abused by the managers of the Russian American Company. At the same time, many of the fur traders had married native women, and a distinctive Creole Aleut culture had gradually developed. So the Russian fur traders came first, they intermarried with the native population, and then they requested missionaries to come and bless their marriages and baptize their children and so forth. And that was the impetus for the 1794 arrival of the 10 monks. Most of them eventually die except St. Herman, who's the only one that lives from the original group. Many of them go back to Russia proper. One of them is consecrated a bishop, and they come back. And on their journey back across the Pacific Ocean, the ship is lost, and they are drowned sorrowfully. But St. Herman is the one that remains behind, and he will live until 1836. New Archangel, which is also the city of Sitka, becomes the new capital in 1808. Fort Ross is built in 1812 in Northern California. It will be sold in 1842 to John Stutter, a Mexican citizen of Swiss origin. Just think about that. A Mexican citizen, because he's California as a part of the Spanish Empire. A Mexican citizen of Swiss origin who would soon discover gold at his lumber mill in the Sacramento Valley, spurring the gold rush of California. It's he who buys Fort Ross in 1842. Fort Ross, though, notably, is the first multi-ethnic community in Northern California, according to Wikipedia, with a combination of native Californians, native Alaskans, Russians, Finns, and Swedes, all living together. Because of the work of the missionaries, you have this flourishing of Christianity amongst the native Alaskans. One of them is named Peter, and many of the Alaskans would go on fur trading expeditions down the coast of the western North America, all the way down to San Francisco and further, hunting seals, and then go back up to Alaska. And so, having become Christian, a young man named Peter goes on this kind of expedition. In 1815, a group of Aleut seal and otter hunters, including Peter, was captured by Spanish sailors who took them to San Francisco for interrogation, with threats of torture, the Roman Catholic priests in California attempted to force the Aleuts to deny their Orthodox faith and to convert to Roman Catholicism. When the Aleuts refused, the priest had a toe severed from each of Peter's feet. Peter still refused to renounce his faith, and the Spanish priest ordered a group of Catholic Indians to cut off each finger of Peter's hands, one joint at a time, finally removing both of his hands. They eventually disemboweled him, crowning his life with martyrdom. They were about to torture the next Aleut when orders were received to release them under escort to their monastery in Monterey. Upon receiving the report of Peter's death from Simeon Yanovsky, St. Herman, back on Kodiak Island, was moved to cry out, "Holy new martyr Peter, pray to God for us." Peter the Aleut was formally recognized as a saint, as the martyr of San Francisco in 1980. We have the account of St. Peter's martyrdom from Simeon Yanovsky, as related by him being St. Peter's cellmate who escaped torture. Simon Yanovsky ended his life as a schema monk, Sergius, in the St. Tikhon of Kaluga Monastery, and he is the author of the Life of St. Herman of Alaska. This is how we know about Peter the Aleut. It is then in 1824 that the future St. Innocent, Metropolitan of Moscow, arrives in Alaska as the parish priest for the parish of Una, Alaska. Una, Alaska is an island in the Aleutian chain. And his parish was that island and all the islands in that region for hundreds of miles. He was the only priest in this area. In a short time, he mastered 6 of the native Alaskan dialects. He devised an alphabet using Cyrillic letters for the most widely used dialect, the Uongan dialect of Aleut. This is the first written language that native Alaskans had. In 1828, he translated portions of the Bible and other church materials into that dialect. In 1834, Father John was transferred to Sitka Island, to the town of New Archangel, later called Sitka, and he devoted himself to the Tlingit people and studied their language and customs. From his studies, There he wrote the scholarly works, Notes on the Kalushchan and Kodiak tongues and other dialects of the Russo-American territories, with a Russian Kalushchan glossary. St. Innocent, when you study Native American language, he is where you begin, using his initial research in the linguistics of the people, because he's the first Westerner to do such work. In 1836, the death of St. Herman of Alaska, and also St. Innocent's first pastoral visit to Fort Ross, which you can read in his life. It's very interesting. He goes to the one of the Catholic monasteries, or one of the the Catholics had established monasteries up the coast, missions. They were called Catholic missions. And he, at one point, visits one of them, and to speak with the priests there in the Catholic mission, they conversed in Latin, because that was the common language they both knew. In 1841, St. Innocent returns to Alaska, though, now as its bishop, its first bishop, who actually settles, and he serves Alaska for 9 years. It's then in 1867 that Alaska is sold to the U.S., and St. Innocent is appointed Metropolitan of Moscow in the same year. And he dies in 1879 as Metropolitan of Moscow, having been also the first bishop of Alaska. In 1977, St. Innocent is glorified as a saint in the Orthodox Church. So, as the first Great Awakening is happening, you have also the spreading of Orthodox Christianity to Alaska through the fur traders initially, and then through the missionary labors of the first monks that went there as missionaries, and then also through the native clergy that were established there, not just Russian clergy. Very early on, you have the establishment of native Orthodox clergy, like St. John Nesletov, and then the work of St. Innocent, who then becomes its first bishop by the 1840s. So these things, in a sense, on very different sides of the coast, are happening simultaneously, which is a fascinating thing to think about. So we'll leave it there. Any questions? Next week, we will not have a class because we have the Feast of Christ's Entry into the Temple on Friday. Thursday night, we'll have all the services, so we'll not have a Wednesday night, so everybody can be rested for Thursday night, because we'll have Vespers, Orthros, and Liturgy Thursday night. So, but then we'll come back and be slowly getting closer to the 20th century. God bless you all.